Somewhere in the quiet past, long before modern cities and electric lights, there came a year when the sky itself seemed to forget how to shine. The sun was still there, but it no longer felt like the sun. Its light, once warm and golden, became pale and weak. Days turned into something strange, neither fully bright nor truly dark. Shadows faded, colors softened, and across distant lands people began to notice something was not quite right. They looked up again and again, wondering if the sky would return to normal. But it didn't, not for a very long time. And no one, not kings, not farmers, not scholars, could understand why. Now, as you settle in and allow your thoughts to slow, let us gently step into this forgotten moment of history, a time that feels almost unreal, and yet it truly happened. This is the story of the year 1258 AD, a year when the sky turned dim, a year when the world grew quieter, colder, and more uncertain, and a mystery that remained unsolved for centuries. Imagine a small village somewhere in medieval Europe. The morning begins as it always does. A faint light spreads across the sky. People wake slowly. A fire is lit. Bread is baked. Animals are fed, but something feels different. The sunlight is weak, not just on this one morning, but every morning that follows. At first, no one says much. Perhaps it is just a passing cloud. Perhaps a change in the weather. But as the days pass, the sky remains strange. It is not dark like night, but it is not bright like day. It is as if a thin veil has been placed over the world, and slowly, quietly, concern begins to grow. Far away in another part of the world, in Asia, the same sky stretches overhead. Travelers walk along dusty roads. Merchants carry goods between cities. Monks sit in silence, watching the horizon. They too notice the change. The sun looks dim, almost like the moon behind a fog. Sometimes it appears bluish, sometimes pale, sometimes barely visible at all. And at night the stars seem sharper, colder, as if the air itself has changed. In those days, people did not have modern science to explain such things. They did not know about atmospheric particles or volcanic ash or global climate systems. Instead, they looked for meaning in other ways. Some believed it was a sign, a message from the heavens. Others thought it might be a warning, a sign that something had gone wrong in the world. And so prayers became more frequent, rituals became more careful. People watched the sky not just with curiosity, but with quiet unease. As time passed, another change began to reveal itself. The air grew colder, not suddenly, not sharply, but slowly, steadily, like a whisper that becomes impossible to ignore. Summers were no longer warm. Fields that once grew strong crops began to struggle. Grains did not ripen as they should. Fruits remained small or failed to grow at all. And farmers who understood the rhythm of the land better than anyone began to worry, because the land was no longer behaving as it should. Imagine standing in a field that has fed your family for generations. You know the soil, you know the seasons, you know when to plant, when to wait, when to harvest. But now something feels different beneath your feet. The ground is colder, the air is quieter, and the crops, are weaker. You wait, you hope, but the harvest never fully comes. And this was not just happening in one place. It was happening across regions, across continents. In Europe, in Asia, in parts of the Middle East, different cultures, different languages, but the same sky, the same dim light, the same slow, creeping cold. Now let us pause for a moment and think quietly. What kind of event could affect the entire world like this? What could change the sky itself for months at a time? In our modern understanding, we might begin to consider natural forces, large ones, forces powerful enough to reach the upper layers of the atmosphere, forces that can spread across the globe. But for the people living in 1258, there was no clear answer, only observation, only experience, only the feeling that something unseen was shaping their world. As the months continued, the effects became harder to ignore. Food became scarce, not everywhere at once, but slowly, region by region. A poor harvest one season might be manageable, but when it happens again and again, the impact grows. Prices rise, supplies shrink, and people begin to feel a quiet tension in their daily lives. Not panic, not chaos, just a steady awareness that something is not right. In some places, written records began to appear. Chroniclers, monks, and scholars carefully noted what they saw. They wrote about the strange sun. They described the dim light. They mentioned the cold summers. But they did not explain it because they could not. They simply recorded it as a mystery, a moment in time that did not behave like any other. And then there is another detail, a small one but important. In some regions, people describe the sun as looking like the moon. Think about that for a moment. The sun, the brightest object in the sky, appearing like the soft glow of the moon. That is not just a poetic image. It is a real observation, a clue, a hint about what might have been happening far above them. Now let us move gently deeper into this idea. For the sun to appear dim, something must have been blocking or scattering its light. Not completely, but enough to change how it looked and felt. This suggests that the atmosphere, the thin layer of air surrounding the Earth, was not clear. Something was in it. Something spread wide enough to affect the entire sky. But what could fill the atmosphere on such a scale? Dust, smoke, ash, and if so, where did it come from? As time continued to pass in 1258, life did not stop. People adapted as they always do. They adjusted their expectations. They worked with what they had. They endured because humans have always been quietly resilient, even in times they do not fully understand. But still, the question remained. Why was this happening? Why had the sky changed? Why had the warmth of the sun faded? Centuries would pass before anyone began to truly understand. The people living through it would never know the answer. For them, it was simply a strange and difficult time. A year, or perhaps longer, when the world felt slightly out of balance. And yet, hidden within this quiet mystery, there was a cause, a real physical event, something that happened far away from most of the people who experienced its effects, something powerful enough to reach the sky itself. But to discover that, we must look not at the sky, but at the earth, deep beneath its surface. In a place where pressure builds slowly, silently, until one day it can no longer be contained. And that is where our story begins to shift, not upward but downward, towards something hidden, something immense, something that, for a brief moment in history, changed the world without being seen. Far from the villages and quiet fields where people watched the dim sky, there existed places on earth where the ground itself held a restless energy. These places were not always easy to notice. They could look like ordinary mountains or quiet islands surrounded by calm seas. But deep beneath them, far below the surface, something was always moving, slowly, silently. Molten rock, heated by the immense pressure inside the earth gathering over time, waiting. In the year 1257, just 1 year before the strange darkness of 1258 began, something extraordinary happened in a distant part of the world. On an island in what we now know as Indonesia, there stood a massive volcano. Today, we call it Mount Samalas. But in those days, it was simply part of the natural world, a mountain like any other, rising quietly into the sky. No one could have imagined what it was about to do. For a long time, the volcano had been building pressure beneath the surface. Magma was rising, gases were collecting, energy was increasing little by little. And then, at some moment in that year, everything changed. The pressure became too great. The earth could no longer hold it in, and the mountain erupted, not in a small or gentle way, but in one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in human history. The explosion was so immense that it tore apart the top of the mountain itself. Rock, ash, and gas were thrown high into the sky, far higher than any cloud, so high that they reached the upper layers of the atmosphere. Imagine standing miles away and hearing a distant sound like thunder, but deeper, longer, and continuous. The sky above the volcano would have turned dark almost instantly. Ash would fall like soft gray snow. The air would feel heavy, difficult to breathe. And the light of the sun would disappear behind a thick, rising cloud. But what makes this event truly important is not just what happened near the volcano. It is what happened after. Because the ash and gases released by the eruption did not simply fall back to the ground. Some of them rose incredibly high, into a part of the atmosphere where winds move across the entire planet. And once they reached that height, they began to travel, slowly, quietly, spreading around the world. This is something that is easy to miss if we only imagine the eruption itself. The explosion is brief, but its effects can last for years, because tiny particles, so small they cannot be seen with the naked eye, can remain suspended in the atmosphere for a very long time. These particles can scatter sunlight. They can reflect it away from the earth, and as a result, less warmth reaches the surface. Now let us return gently to the people living in 1258. They did not see the eruption. They did not know about Mount Samalas, but they experienced its consequences: the dim sun, the pale light, the colder seasons. All of these may have been connected to an event happening thousands of kilometers away. It is a quiet kind of connection, one that reminds us how deeply linked our world truly is. An eruption in one place, changing the sky in another. a mountain breaking apart, affecting the lives of people who would never even know it existed. As the particles spread through the atmosphere, they formed a thin veil around the Earth, not thick enough to block the sun completely, but enough to soften its light, enough to change its color, enough to cool the air just a little. But when that little change lasts for months, even years, it becomes something much larger. Crops begin to fail. Seasons become uncertain, and the delicate balance that supports human life begins to shift. There is something almost quiet and subtle about this kind of disaster. It does not arrive suddenly like a storm. It does not announce itself loudly. Instead, it unfolds slowly, day by day, month by month, a gradual change that becomes impossible to ignore. In some historical records, people described unusual weather patterns, unseasonal rains, colder temperatures, unpredictable growing conditions. These are the kinds of effects we would expect if the sunlight reaching the Earth was reduced, even slightly. But here is where the mystery becomes even more interesting. For a very long time, historians and scientists did not know exactly which eruption caused this global change. They had clues. They had records of strange skies and cold years. They even had ice cores, layers of ancient ice that trap tiny particles from the atmosphere. These ice cores showed clear evidence that something major had happened around that time. A large amount of volcanic material had entered the atmosphere, but the source remained unknown. It was like having a puzzle with one important piece missing. They knew something had happened, they could see its effects, but they did not know where it began. And so, the mystery continued for centuries, until slowly new discoveries began to appear. Scientists started to study volcanic regions more carefully. They examined ancient deposits of ash. They compared chemical signatures, tiny details within the ash particles, to the layers found in ice cores. And over time, a connection began to form, a match, a realization that pointed toward a specific place. That island in Indonesia, that volcano Mount Samalas. The eruption of 1257 was not just large, it was enormous, one of the largest in the last several thousand years. Powerful enough to send vast amounts of ash and gas into the stratosphere, the upper layer of the atmosphere where these particles can remain for a long time. And once there, they spread across the globe. This discovery helped answer a question that had remained open for generations. Why did the sky grow dim in 1258? Why did the climate change so suddenly? Why did people across different parts of the world describe the same strange conditions? Because they were all experiencing the same event, not directly, but through its global effects. And yet, even with this explanation, there is something quietly fascinating about the way this story unfolded. Because for the people living through it, there was no explanation, only experience, only observation, only the feeling that the world had become slightly unfamiliar. It reminds us that there are moments in history where cause and effect are separated by great distances. where something happens in one place and is felt in another, where understanding comes much later, long after the event itself has passed. As time moved forward, the particles in the atmosphere slowly began to settle, the sky cleared, the sunlight returned to its usual brightness, temperatures gradually stabilized, and life continued. But the memory of those strange years remained, in writings, in records, in quiet descriptions of a sun that looked like the moon. And even today, when we look back at this period, we can still feel that sense of quiet mystery. Not because we have no answers, but because the answers came so much later than the experience itself. It is a reminder of how vast and complex our world is, how events can unfold beyond our awareness, and how sometimes the sky above us can change without warning and without explanation, at least not right away. And this leads us to another gentle question. If such a powerful eruption could affect the entire world in the past, what other moments like this might have happened, quietly shaping history in ways we are only beginning to understand? As the dim light continued to stretch across the months, life, in many parts of the world, began to adjust in quiet and careful ways. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, as people noticed that the patterns they had always trusted were no longer steady. In medieval Europe, much of daily life depended on the rhythm of the seasons. Planting, growing, harvesting, these were not just tasks. They were a kind of silent agreement between people and the land, an understanding built over generations. But now that agreement felt uncertain. Farmers would wake early, step into their fields, and look at the sky. The sun was there, but weaker. The warmth they expected did not fully arrive. And so they waited. Perhaps tomorrow would be better. Perhaps the next week, but the change lingered. Seeds planted into the soil did not always grow as they should. Some sprouted slowly, some failed entirely. And even when crops did grow, they often lacked strength. Grains were smaller, harvests were thinner, and this created a quiet but growing concern. Food, something so ordinary and constant, began to feel less certain, not completely gone, but less reliable. And when something as basic as food becomes uncertain, people notice. In towns and villages, markets reflected this change. Supplies were smaller. Prices began to rise, not sharply at first, but gradually enough for people to feel it. A loaf of bread might cost a little more. A sack of grain might be harder to find, and so people adjusted. They used less. They saved more. They shared when they could. Meanwhile, in parts of Asia, similar patterns were unfolding. The land responded to the same dim sunlight, the same cooler air, the same shift in seasonal balance. In regions where rice and other crops depended on steady warmth and timing, even a small change could affect the outcome. And here, too, people began to notice that something was different. In historical writings from these regions, there are mentions of unusual weather, of seasons that did not behave as expected, of harvests that were weaker than normal. And again, no clear explanation, only careful observation. Now, let us pause gently and consider something important. The people living during this time were deeply connected to nature. They did not have machines or systems to protect them from environmental change. Their lives were closely tied to the land, the sky, and the seasons. So when the sky changed, their lives changed with it. But even in this uncertainty, there was a quiet strength. Communities adapted. Families supported each other. People found ways to continue, even when conditions were not ideal. Because human life throughout history has always carried this quiet resilience. In some regions, religious and spiritual responses became more noticeable. When something could not be explained, people often turned inward or upward. Prayers became more frequent, ceremonies more careful. There was a sense that the natural world and the unseen world were somehow connected, and that perhaps in some way balance needed to be restored. This was not fear in a loud or chaotic sense. It was something softer, a quiet searching, a gentle attempt to understand something beyond explanation. As the months continued, the dimness of the sky remained a constant presence, not overwhelming but always there, a subtle reminder that something unusual had taken place. And yet life did not stop. Children were still born, stories were still told, people still gathered, worked, rested, and hoped. Because even in uncertain times, the flow of life continues. Now let us move slowly to another part of the world, the Middle East, a region with long traditions of scholarship, observation, and record keeping. Here, too, the sky was watched carefully, and here, too, the changes were noticed. Writers and scholars described unusual atmospheric conditions. They noted the dimness of the sun, the changes in temperature, the irregular patterns in weather. These were not exaggerated accounts. They were calm, thoughtful observations, attempts to understand what was happening using the knowledge available at the time. What is remarkable is that these records from different parts of the world all describe similar experiences, different voices, different cultures, but the same quiet story, a sky that had changed, a sun that had softened, a world that felt just slightly out of balance. And this brings us to a gentle realization. Even without modern communication, even without shared knowledge, human beings were observing the same global event, each in their own way, each through their own understanding, but all connected by the same sky above them. As time passed, some regions experienced more difficulty than others. Where food production was already delicate, the effects were stronger. Where communities had fewer resources, the challenges were deeper. But in many places, the changes remained gradual, manageable, though not easy. This is an important detail, because it reminds us that not all historical events are loud or sudden. Some are quiet, slow, unfolding over time in ways that are easy to overlook but deeply meaningful. And then slowly, almost quietly, things began to change again, not all at once, but gradually. The sky became a little clearer, the sunlight a little stronger, the air a little warmer. At first, it might not have been noticed, just a small difference, a slightly brighter morning, a slightly warmer afternoon. But over time, the pattern became clearer. The world was returning to what it had been before. The particles in the atmosphere, the invisible veil that had softened the sunlight, were beginning to settle, falling slowly back to the earth, dispersing, fading. And with that, the balance of the natural world began to restore itself. Crops improved. Seasons became more predictable. The familiar rhythm of life slowly returned. For the people living through it, there was no clear moment of ending. No announcement that the strange period was over, just a gradual shift back to normal. And perhaps after some time, the memory of those dim years became softer, less immediate, more like a story, something remembered but not fully understood. But even as the world returned to its usual patterns, the question remained: what had truly happened? What had caused the sky to change? What unseen force had reached across continents, touching so many lives? For centuries, this question lingered, quietly, patiently, waiting for a time when it could be answered. And now, as we look back with modern understanding, we can see the connection. The distant eruption, the particles in the sky, the cooling of the earth, all parts of the same story. But there is still something quietly powerful about the fact that the people who experienced it never knew. They lived through a global event without ever seeing its source. They felt its effects without understanding its cause. And perhaps that is what makes this story so gentle and so human. It is not just about a volcano or the atmosphere or the climate. It is about people living their lives, observing the world, adapting even when they do not fully understand what is happening around them. And as we sit here now thinking about that distant time, there is a quiet connection between us and them. Because even today, there are things in our world that we are still learning to understand. Slowly, carefully, one discovery at a time. Long after the skies had cleared, and the memory of those dim years had softened into distant stories, the earth itself continued to hold a quiet record of what had happened, not in books, not in spoken words, but in ice. High above sea level, in places where the air remains cold throughout the year, snow falls gently, layer upon layer. Each snowfall adds a thin sheet to the surface. And over time, as more snow gathers, the lower layers are pressed down, slowly turning into ice. This process continues year after year, century after century. And as it does, something remarkable happens. Tiny particles from the atmosphere, dust, ash, even traces of distant events become trapped within these layers. Like pages in a book, the ice begins to store a history of the sky itself. In places like Greenland and Antarctica, this frozen record stretches back thousands of years, each layer representing a moment in time, a quiet archive of Earth's past. And for a long time, this archive remained untouched, hidden beneath the surface, waiting. Then, in the modern age, scientists began to explore these frozen regions with a new kind of curiosity. They were not just looking at the surface. They wanted to go deeper, to understand what the Earth had experienced long before written records. So they began to drill, slowly, carefully. They extracted long cylinders of ice from deep below the surface. These are called ice cores, and within them, layer by layer, lay a detailed record of the atmosphere from centuries ago. When scientists examined these ice cores, they noticed something unusual. Around the layers corresponding to the late 1250s, there was a significant increase in certain particles, tiny fragments of volcanic ash, and chemical traces, especially sulfur compounds that are often released during large volcanic eruptions. This was the first strong clue, a sign that something powerful had happened around that time, something large enough to send material high into the atmosphere and spread it across the globe. But this discovery raised another quiet question. If there had been a massive volcanic eruption, where was it? Which volcano had caused it? At first, the answer was not clear. There were many volcanoes around the world. Some had known eruptions. Others had histories that were not fully understood. And so the search began. Scientists compared the chemical signatures found in the ice cores with samples from volcanic regions. Each volcano leaves behind a kind of unique fingerprint in its ash, a specific combination of minerals and elements. By matching these fingerprints, it becomes possible to trace ash particles back to their source. This process was slow, careful, and it required patience, years of study, many small discoveries, each one adding a piece to the puzzle. And then gradually a connection began to form. The chemical patterns found in the ice-matched samples taken from volcanic deposits in Indonesia, specifically from the remains of a long-forgotten eruption, Mount Samalas. This was not just any eruption, it was immense, so powerful that it reshaped the landscape itself. The top of the mountain collapsed, forming a large crater. Ash spread across vast distances, and enormous amounts of gas were released into the atmosphere. When scientists realized this connection, the story began to come together. The eruption in 1257, the ash and gases rising high into the atmosphere, the particles spreading around the world, the dimming of the sun in 1258, the cooler temperatures, the unusual weather patterns, all parts of the same event. It was a quiet moment of understanding, not sudden, not dramatic, but deeply satisfying. A mystery that had lasted for centuries, gently resolved through careful observation and study. And yet, even with this understanding, there is something almost humbling about the way the answer was found. It did not come from a single discovery or a single idea. It came from many small steps, from people studying ice and rock and air, from connecting details across time and distance. It reminds us that knowledge often grows slowly, just like the layers of ice themselves, one layer at a time. Now, let us pause for a moment and reflect on something deeper. The people of 1258 experienced a global event without knowing its cause. Centuries later, people were able to uncover that cause without ever experiencing the event directly. This connection between past and present is quiet but powerful. It shows us that the earth keeps its own records, even when human memory fades, even when stories are forgotten. The natural world continues to hold the truth, waiting to be discovered. And it also reminds us of something else, that the world we live in is deeply interconnected. An eruption in one place can affect climates across continents. A change in the atmosphere can influence the growth of crops thousands of kilometers away. Everything is linked in ways that are not always visible. As time moves forward, scientists continue to study events like this, not just to understand the past, but to better understand the present and the future. Because the same forces that shaped the world in 1258 still exist today. Volcanoes still erupt, particles still rise into the atmosphere, and the balance of climate remains delicate. But unlike the people of the past, we now have tools to observe, measure, and understand these changes. We can see patterns. We can make connections. We can prepare in ways that were not possible before. And yet, there is still a sense of quiet wonder, because even with all our knowledge, the earth remains vast, complex, and in many ways still mysterious. So when we look back at the year 1258, we are not just looking at a strange moment in history. We are looking at a reminder of how powerful nature can be, how connected our world truly is, and how understanding often comes slowly, gently, over time. And perhaps as you rest and let your thoughts drift, there is something comforting in that idea, that even the most mysterious events eventually find their place in the story of the world, not through urgency, not through force, but through patience, through curiosity, and through the quiet human desire to understand. Even after the mystery of the dim sky begins to feel understood, there is still something quietly lingering beneath the surface of this story. Because events like this do not simply pass and disappear, they leave traces, not just in ice or in rock, but in the slow movement of human history itself. When the sunlight softened and the air cooled even slightly, it did more than affect the sky. It gently shifted the rhythm of life. And when the rhythm of life changes, even in small ways, the effects can spread much further than we might expect. In some regions, the weaker harvests of those years may have led to subtle changes in how communities lived. Food, once abundant, became something to think about more carefully. Storage became more important. Planning became more cautious. And over time, these small adjustments shaped behavior, quietly, almost invisibly. In certain places, a series of poor growing seasons could lead to movement. Families leaving one area searching for better land or more stable conditions. Not in large, sudden migrations, but in slow, gradual shifts. A village becoming smaller, another growing slightly larger, the landscape of human settlement gently changing. And then there is another layer to consider: trade. In the medieval world, trade routes connected distant regions. Goods moved across long distances: grain, cloth, spices, tools. But when production changed, even slightly, these networks felt it. A smaller harvest in one region could mean less to trade. Prices could rise. Availability could shift. And these small changes, when spread across many places, could influence entire systems. Again, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly like the dimming of the sun itself. There is something almost quiet and thoughtful about this kind of influence. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings, wars, or great events. Sometimes it is shaped by something as simple as a change in sunlight, a slightly colder season, a harvest that did not fully arrive. Now let us turn gently toward another idea: memory. The people who lived through those years did not have a clear explanation, but they remembered the experience. They told stories, they wrote small notes, they passed down observations, and in doing so they preserved something important, not the cause but the feeling. A sky that looked different, a sun that felt distant, a world that seemed just a little out of balance. Over generations, these memories may have softened, details may have changed, but the sense of something unusual remained, like a quiet echo moving through time. And this raises a gentle question: how many other moments like this exist in history? Moments where something changed quietly across the world but was never fully understood at the time. Perhaps more than we realize, because the earth is always moving, always changing, often in ways that are too slow or too distant for us to notice immediately. And yet every now and then something happens that gently touches everything: the sky, the air, the land, and the people who live within it. The year 1258 was one such moment, a time when the world shifted just enough to be felt everywhere, but not enough to be easily explained. Now, as we come closer to the quiet edge of this story, there is no need for a sharp ending, because this is not a story that ends suddenly. It is one that fades gently like the dim sky itself. The particles in the atmosphere settled, the sunlight returned, the seasons found their rhythm again, and life continued. People returned to their fields, to their routines, to their quiet everyday moments, and slowly the world felt familiar again. But somewhere deep within the layers of ice, within the pages of old writings, within the silent memory of the earth, that moment remained. A small, quiet chapter in a much larger story. And now, as you rest and let your thoughts drift, there is something calming in this understanding, that even when the world feels uncertain, even when the sky changes in ways we do not understand, there is a larger balance at work: slow, steady, patient. The earth moves through its cycles, and we in our own quiet way move with it, learning, adapting, remembering. And perhaps that is what this story gently teaches us, not just about the past, but about the nature of the world itself. A world that is vast, connected, and filled with quiet mysteries waiting to be understood. So as the night grows softer and your thoughts begin to settle, you can imagine that distant year: the pale sun, the silent sky, the slow return of light. And in that image there is no urgency, no fear, only a calm awareness that even the strangest moments eventually pass. And the world always finds its way back to balance. As the memory of that distant year grows softer, there is still one more quiet layer to explore. Not in the sky, not in the ice, but in the way we understand time itself. When we look back at history, we often imagine it as a series of clear events: a beginning, a middle, an end. But the truth is, most moments in history do not feel that way when they are being lived. They feel uncertain, unclear, open. The people of 1258 did not know they were living through a mystery. They did not see their time as unusual in a dramatic sense. They simply woke up each day, noticing small changes, a slightly dimmer sky, a slightly cooler breeze, a harvest that felt just a little less certain. And this is something quietly important because it reminds us that history is not only made of big, obvious moments, it is also made of small shifts, subtle changes, things that are easy to overlook while they are happening. Only later, when we step back, do we begin to see the pattern, the connection, the meaning. In a way, this story is not just about the past. It is also about how we understand the present. Because even now, in our own time, there may be things changing around us slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed. And perhaps years from now, people will look back and see patterns that we cannot yet fully understand, just as we are now looking back at 1258. There is something deeply calming in this idea, not because everything is simple, but because everything unfolds at its own pace. Understanding does not arrive all at once. It comes gradually, layer by layer, like snow turning into ice, like ash settling from the sky, like a mystery slowly becoming clear. Now let us return once more to that image. A quiet morning somewhere in the medieval world, a person steps outside, looks up, and sees the pale sun hanging in the sky, soft, distant, unfamiliar. They do not know about distant volcanoes. They do not know about particles in the atmosphere. They do not know that people in other parts of the world are seeing the same thing. They only know what they feel, that the world is slightly different, that something has changed. And yet they continue, they live their day, they care for their family, they move forward. There is a quiet strength in that, a gentle resilience that does not need explanation. And perhaps that is the most human part of this story, not the eruption, not the science, but the way people lived through something they did not understand and still found a way to continue. As time passes, the sky clears, the sunlight returns, and the strange feeling slowly fades into memory. Years go by, generations pass, and what was once a lived experience becomes a distant story, then a faint record, then almost forgotten. Until one day, centuries later, someone looks deeper, into the ice, into the earth, into the quiet traces left behind, and begins to understand. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to see the outline of what once happened. And in that moment, the past and the present meet, a question from long ago gently answered by the curiosity of the future. This is the quiet beauty of human understanding. It does not rush. It does not demand. It simply continues, asking, exploring, learning. And so, as you rest now, letting your thoughts slow down, you can hold this story not as something distant, but as something connected, a reminder that the world is always moving, always changing, always offering new mysteries and new understandings. The sky above you tonight may look calm and familiar, the stars steady, the air still. But somewhere deep within the earth, forces are always at work. slowly shaping the future just as they shaped the past. And yet, there is no need to rush to understand it all, because time itself is patient, and so is knowledge. You can simply rest in the awareness that every moment, even the quietest ones, are part of a much larger story. A story that began long before us and will continue long after. And within that story, there is a steady rhythm, a balance, a quiet return to calm even after the most unusual changes. So as your mind begins to drift and your thoughts grow softer, you can imagine that distant year once more. The dim sky, the pale sun, the slow passing of days, and then the gentle return of light. And in that slow return, there is something deeply peaceful, a reminder that even when the world feels uncertain, it does not stay that way forever. It changes, it settles, it finds its balance again, just like the sky did all those centuries ago. And as this quiet story continues to unfold, there is still more to notice if we look gently enough. Because sometimes the most interesting parts of history are not the events themselves, but the spaces in between them, the pauses, the slow changes, the moments where nothing seems to happen and yet everything is quietly shifting. After the skies of 1258 began to clear and the sunlight slowly returned, life did not instantly feel normal again. There was no single morning when people woke up and said, "Everything is as it was before." Instead, the return was gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. A slightly brighter afternoon, a slightly warmer breeze, a harvest that felt a little more certain than the last. And in these small changes, people began to rebuild their sense of trust in the world around them, not consciously, but naturally. A farmer planting seeds might feel a little more hopeful. A traveler walking under the sky might notice the light feels warmer. A family sharing a meal might feel a quiet sense of relief, even if they could not explain why. This is how balance returns, not through sudden clarity, but through small, steady moments. And yet, even as the world settled, something had changed, not just in the environment, but in memory, in experience. Because once you have lived through a time when the sky itself felt uncertain, a part of you remembers that it can happen, even if you do not fully understand how or why. This kind of memory does not always stay in clear words. It becomes a feeling, a quiet awareness, a sense that the world, while stable, is not fixed. And this awareness can shape how people think, how they prepare, how they tell stories, even generations later. In some ways, this is how knowledge begins, not as complete understanding, but as a collection of experiences passed down, slowly forming patterns. A story told by a grandparent, a note written in a quiet record, an observation repeated across time. And eventually these fragments become something more, a question, a curiosity, a desire to understand. Now, let us gently shift our attention to another thought. Not about the past, but about the nature of events like this. The eruption of a distant volcano, the dimming of the sun, the cooling of the air, these are all part of natural processes. They are not unusual in the sense that they never happen. In fact, the Earth has experienced many such events across its long history. But what makes each one meaningful is how it connects to human life, how it is experienced, how it is remembered. Because the Earth moves on its own timescale, slow, immense, often beyond immediate human awareness. But human life is different. It is lived day by day, moment by moment, through feelings, observations, small changes. And when these two timescales meet, something unique happens. A natural event becomes a human story. The year 1258 is one such story, a moment when the vast processes of the earth touched the everyday lives of people across the world, not loudly, not violently, but quietly, gently, persistently. And perhaps that is why it feels so calming to reflect on, because it does not overwhelm, it does not rush, it simply unfolds at its own pace. Now, as your thoughts continue to slow, you might begin to notice something else, a sense of distance, not just in time, but in feeling. The worries of that year, the uncertainty, the quiet concern, they have all passed. They belong to another time, another world. And yet, the people who lived then were not so different from us. They noticed the sky. They cared about their families. They wondered about things they could not explain. And in that way, there is a quiet connection across centuries, across changing worlds. It is easy to think of history as something separate, something distant, but in moments like this, it feels closer, more human, more familiar. A person standing under a dim sky, wondering what has changed, is not so different from anyone in any time looking up and asking a quiet question. And perhaps that is where the deepest calm in this story comes from, not just in the return of sunlight, but in the realization that uncertainty is a natural part of the world, and that it does not last forever. Things shift, they settle, they become clear again, just as the sky did. As the years passed after 1258, the world continued forward. New seasons came, new events unfolded, new stories began. And the dim sky became part of the past, a memory, a quiet chapter in a much larger story. But even now, if we listen carefully, it still speaks, not loudly, but softly. It reminds us to notice small changes, to be patient with what we do not yet understand, to trust that clarity often comes in time. And as you rest here now, letting your breathing slow, your thoughts soften, you can carry that quiet understanding with you. That the world is always in motion, always adjusting, always finding its balance. And that even the most unusual moments, the dimmest skies, the quietest uncertainties, are part of a rhythm that continues gently, endlessly, until everything settles once more. And now, as this story begins to settle into a quieter rhythm, we can allow it to slow even further, not toward an ending, but toward a kind of stillness. Because beyond the events, beyond the discoveries, beyond even the understanding, there is something else that remains, a feeling, a calm awareness of how the world moves. If you imagine that distant time once more, the year when the sky grew dim, you might begin to notice not just what changed, but how gently it changed. There was no single moment when everything shifted, no clear line between before and after, only a gradual transition, a soft dimming, a quiet cooling. And in the same way, the return of light was not sudden. It did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, almost invisibly, until one day, the world felt familiar again. There is something deeply peaceful in that kind of change because it does not demand attention. It does not rush. It simply unfolds at its own pace. And perhaps without realizing it, you have already begun to follow that same rhythm. Your thoughts, once active and searching, may now feel a little slower, a little softer, like the sky returning gently to calm. You can imagine the people of that time not as figures in history, but as quiet presences in a distant world, moving through their days, waking with the soft light, working under the pale sky, resting as night returned. There is no urgency in their movements, no need to rush, only the steady flow of time carrying them forward. And as you rest here now, you are not so different. You are also moving through a quiet moment, a space where nothing needs to be solved, nothing needs to be answered. The mystery has already unfolded. The story has already been told. And what remains is simply the calm that follows. If you listen closely, you might almost feel the stillness of that distant world, the quiet fields, the soft air, the gentle presence of the sky above. The sun once dim, now steady again, the light once uncertain, now familiar. And in that image there is no tension, no question, only a quiet balance. Time continues as it always does, slowly, patiently, without effort. And as it moves, everything finds its place. The ash settles. The air clears. The seasons return. Just as thoughts settle, just as the mind becomes clear, just as rest arrives naturally. There is no need to hold onto the details anymore. No need to follow every part of the story. You can let it drift gently into the background, like a memory fading into calm, like a distant year becoming quiet again. And as that happens, you may begin to notice your breathing, slow, even, effortless. Each breath like a passing moment, each moment like a soft step forward. There is nothing to reach for, nothing to figure out, only this quiet space. And in this space, everything is at ease. The world, with all its changes, continues far beyond this moment, but here now there is only stillness. The same stillness that followed the dim sky, the same calm that returned with the light. A gentle reminder that everything in its own time finds its balance again. And so, as your thoughts grow quieter and the story fades into the distance, you can simply rest, carried softly by time, surrounded by calm, until even the memory of the story becomes light and everything settles into silence. And even within this stillness, there is no true ending, only a gentle continuation. Because the world does not stop when a story becomes quiet, it simply keeps moving in its slow, steady way. Long after the year of the dim sky had passed, long after the people who lived through it were gone, the earth continued its quiet cycles. Seasons turning, winds moving, oceans shifting. And somewhere far from where anyone might notice, another mountain might begin to gather its energy, deep beneath the surface, slowly, silently, not as a threat, not as something to fear, but as part of the natural rhythm of the world. The same rhythm that has always been there, the same rhythm that shaped the past and will shape the future. And yet, for all its vastness, The world also holds moments of calm, moments like this one, where everything feels still, balanced, at ease. If you imagine the sky now not as it was in 1258, but as it is in a quiet, peaceful night, you might see it clearly, soft, open, endless. The stars resting gently in the darkness, the air cool and steady. Nothing hidden, nothing uncertain, only quiet clarity. And within that sky there is a sense of space, a sense of distance from all questions, all worries, all things that once seemed important. They fade, just like the dimness faded, just like the ash settled. Everything finds its place in time. You do not need to follow the story any further. You do not need to hold onto its meaning, because what matters has already been felt, not as facts, but as a quiet sense of understanding. That change is natural, that uncertainty passes, that balance returns. And now even those thoughts can begin to soften, like footsteps fading away, like echoes becoming silence. The mind grows still, the body at rest, and time continues gently without effort. If another thought appears, it can simply pass, like a cloud drifting across the sky. No need to hold it, no need to follow it, just let it move on. And in its place there is calm, a deep, steady calm. The same calm that follows every change, the same calm that waits quietly beneath every moment. And as you rest here, you are part of that calm, not separate from it, not outside it, but within it. A small, peaceful moment in a vast and gentle world. There is nothing more to add, nothing more to explain, only this quiet space. And in this space, everything is already enough. So the story, like the dim sky before it, slowly fades, not into nothing, but into stillness. A stillness that remains long after the words are gone. And as the night continues and rest comes naturally, you can simply drift without effort, without thought, into quiet, into calm, into sleep. And now, even the idea of continuing begins to soften, not because the story has nowhere to go, but because it no longer needs to go anywhere at all. There is a point in every quiet story where movement becomes stillness, where words become space, where understanding becomes something you feel rather than something you follow. You have already traveled far across time, across distant lands, through dim skies and quiet questions, through slow changes and gentle returns. And now, there is nothing left to search for. The world of that distant year has settled, the sky has cleared, the light has returned, and all that remains is calm. If you imagine that sky one last time, not dim, not uncertain, but clear, open, and softly glowing, you may notice how easy it feels to simply rest beneath it. No questions, no need to understand, just the quiet presence of the moment. Your thoughts may come and go like faint traces in the air, but they do not need your attention. They do not need your effort. They can pass just as the dim sky passed, and beneath them there is stillness, a stillness that has always been there, waiting quietly, unchanged. You do not need to hold onto the story anymore. You do not need to remember every detail, because what mattered has already settled within you. A sense of calm, a sense of quiet understanding, a gentle reminder that everything moves in its own time. And now, even that reminder can fade. leaving only rest. The kind of rest that does not ask anything from you. The kind of rest that simply allows you to be, breathing slowly, drifting gently, with nothing to do, nowhere to go. Just this quiet moment stretching softly into stillness. And as the night deepens and the world grows quieter, you can let go completely, like the ash that settled from the sky, like the light that returned without effort. Everything finding its place without needing to be guided, without needing to be understood, only allowed. And in that allowing there is peace, a deep, steady, peaceful quiet, where even the last traces of the story fade gently away, until there is nothing left but calm, and silence, and rest. And so, without any sudden ending, the story simply comes to rest. The dim sky of that distant year fades completely into the past. The pale sun returns to its quiet, steady glow. The seasons continue their gentle rhythm just as they always have. What once felt uncertain becomes a memory. What once felt mysterious becomes part of a larger understanding. And what once changed the world settles softly into history. The people of that time lived through it without ever knowing why. And yet they endured, they adapted, they continued. And centuries later, we look back not just with answers, but with a quiet sense of connection. To them, to the earth, to the slow, patient movement of time itself. Because this story was never only about the sky, or the sun, or even the hidden force beneath the earth. It was about something much simpler, something deeply human. The way we live through uncertainty, the way we adjust to change, the way we continue even when we do not fully understand. And perhaps that is the calm truth this story leaves behind, that the world will always shift in ways both seen and unseen, but it will also return. Balance will come back. Light will return, just as it did all those centuries ago. So now there is nothing more to follow, nothing more to uncover, only a quiet sense of completion, like the final light at the end of a long, gentle day. And as this story settles into stillness, you can rest with it, knowing that everything in its own time finds its way back to calm. And in that calm, the story ends.